right, so for my land acknowledgement, I just wanted to take a moment. I'm currently joining you guys from Washington, D.C. I usually live in Annapolis, but I'm actually house sitting for a friend right now. Um, and so I just want to take a moment and recognize the stolen land in which we are inhibiting right now. This land that I'm joining you from was the traditional land of the Piscataway and the Nacoch tank. And so I would like to encourage everyone to take a little bit more time to learn about the two tribes that had historically lived in these areas, and the Piscataway still do live in different parts of Maryland. Um, and so the best way to look that up is using the link native-lands.ca, and you can kind of search for where you're at right now. And just to give a little bit more background on the two groups that I just shared about, the Piscataway were one of the most prevalent tribes in the Chesapeake region at the time of European contact. Today, the Piscataway still live in Anne Arundel County, in Calvert County, in Charles County, Prince George's, St. Mary's, and Wacomico counties in Maryland. They actually are officially recognized as a tribe by the state of Maryland, which happened in 2012, and they're the first group to be officially recognized by the state of Maryland. And the Nacoch tank are also known as the Anacostan, and they were a group who lived on the banks of the Anacostia River in what became Washington, D.C. They had a sizable village of approximately 500 natives, and they worked really closely with a lot of the wildlife and kind of thrived in this area on fur trade. Unfortunately, after colonization happened, a lot of diseases from European groups kind of took them out, which is really sad. And so the last of them moved to what is currently Theodore Roosevelt Island on the Potomac River. And that's kind of the last that we had contact with that group. But I think it's really important to kind of take a moment and recognize, where I'm joining you from and maybe where other people are joining from, and to kind of share a little bit more about the history. And so for my icebreakers, for those of you that are on Zoom, I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask. And what I'm going to ask everyone to do is to do something called a chat waterfall, which I don't know if anybody has done before. So I will take just a moment to explain what that means. But basically, I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to ask everyone to type an answer into the chat box. And then you won't send it right away. You will wait for me to say go, and then we're all going to send our answers at the same time, and it'll create a little bit of a waterfall in the chat. And then I can kind of see your answers and maybe read a couple of them and get to know you guys a little bit better that are here. And so the first thing that I just wanted to kind of ask is maybe where you work or what brought you to this presentation tonight. And so I'll give you guys a little bit of time to type that in the chat, and then I will tell everyone to send at the same time. So just a short little blurb, it doesn't have to be very long, about what brought you to this presentation or where you work. And I'll give it maybe 30 seconds or so. So if you haven't pressed send yet, go ahead and press send, and I can see everybody's answers. Great. So I see, Saranella works at Audubon Naturalist Society, and my chat scrolled. I wanted to bring the intersectionality of the Latino community into the spotlight. I love that. Let's see. Marietta, UANS, and LCW brought me here. And I love that you're here representing the Black and Latinx Birders Fund. I'm really excited to see that here. Alyssa works at the Patapsco Valley State Park. Lucas, you're a graduate student at Christopher Newport University. And I'm really excited to see that you're a member of both of those communities and you're here. Denise, working at ANS, I'm really glad to see that you're here. And Ingrid, based in Washington, D.C., and also queer. I'm really glad to see all of you guys here tonight. All right. And so the next little introduction that I have, or the next question, is going to be, when you think of the word conservation, what is kind of the first next word that comes to your mind? And so I just want one word, and don't press send just yet. We will all press enter at the same time, and then I can read all of your answers there as well. Protection, community, education, environment, nature. And those are all important things. I think that when I think of conservation, those are all of the things that come to my mind as well. And I think that it will take a lot of education, a lot of protection, but we're all on the way there. Okay, I have a couple more. And so when you think of somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, what's the first thing that you think of when you think of that person? And so again, don't press send just yet. I'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds. Open-hearted, valuable, powerful, and love. I love all of those responses. Community. That's one of the things that I really love about, that particular part of my identity and that community. I think that, we're very powerful and resilient. There's a lot of community and a lot of people that really care about each other. And so then the last kind of question that I had was, when you think of somebody who's Latino or Latina or Latine, what's the first thing that you think of when you think of them? And so again, we're not going to press send just yet. We're just going to type it in the chat, and I'll give you 15 seconds or so. Love, hardworking, resilient, Latin America, poderosa. Again, I love all of those. I think resilient is going to be a term that I say a lot today, and hardworking, yeah. All right, well, thank you guys for doing that. And let's continue on. And so there's a couple community agreements that I had come up with on my own that I just want to kind of set the stage with. And I'll encourage, if you have any other ones that you want to add to this, please add them into the chat. But I want to make sure that this space is a space where people feel like they can speak up if they have anything they want to add or ask questions. And also just to make it a safe space. And so the first thing that I love to think about is listening to understand and not to respond. It also helps me kind of be a better active listener if I'm not thinking about how I'm going to respond to somebody else. Speak from the first person if you do have anything to add. It's really important to use I language. We're all parts of different communities, and it can be not great to speak on behalf of other people. Assuming good intent, but owning your impact. So if you say something that, maybe doesn't come off in the way that you had wanted it to, we're assuming that everybody here is here to learn and here to, kind of not harm other people. Move up, move up. So if you have something to say, definitely feel free to share it in the chat while I'm kind of speaking. And so also know like when you should move up if you're more quiet, or maybe if you do speak a lot, maybe when you can move back and let other people share. It's okay to share how you feel in the chat. I definitely encourage anybody to share any feelings that they may have about what I'm going to share and what I'm going to talk about. Treating other people the way that they want to be treated. Again, that's the platinum rule, not the golden rule. I think it's really important that we all respect each other and respect the way that, maybe I'm not going to be maybe I don't want to be treated the same way as other people. Respecting confidentiality. So again, sometimes when I do presentations like this, people will share things that are very personal. And so I encourage you, if you have a lesson that you learned, take it, but any personal things that might be shared, leave that here in this space. Making space for multiple truths. I think that there's a lot of things that I might cover that may be different from the ways that you've learned things, and that's okay. We all have our own truths, and we can talk about that. And so, like, let's talk and learn. I want to make this interactive. I encourage you to use the chat as much as possible, because I don't want to sit here and chat at you guys for a full hour without any other people responding. And so does anybody have anything else that they want to add? Feel free to put it in the chat, and then I will continue to move on, but I will read it if it comes through. So a little bit about me, and I don't want to spend too much time showing you guys pictures of me on the slide here, but I'm just kind of sharing, my background and where I'm coming from. So I work at the Chesapeake Bay Trust. I am currently a program coordinator. I actually was just promoted the beginning of this month. And I work on a couple of things for the trust. Some of that is for an oyster innovation program that we run. I'm also managing our pre-K through 12 environmental education mini grant program now. And then I work really closely with a colleague on the Chesapeake Conservation Corps, which is a youth workforce development program. And then I'm tying in a lot of education about my identities as a person of color and as a queer person, and kind of educating my coworkers there. I also am on the board of Annapolis Pride, and I serve as their vice chair right now, as well as I chair the governance committee. And so Annapolis Pride, we obviously throw a parade and festival every year, but we also do more than that. We really want to celebrate the LGBTQ plus community in Annapolis, and we really want to make sure that Annapolis is a safe and diverse space for everyone. And so, we do a little bit of advocacy work where we can, and awareness building. So there's lots of work that we do besides just having a parade and festival. And then the last thing that I've done a lot of work with in the past is work with a group called Out for Sustainability. And so they're one of the only groups that I know that kind of really works specifically at the intersection of LGBTQIA plus and environmental issues. And so they're right now working on a little bit of kind of a relaunch due to some internal changes, but there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out soon that they're working on. And then I also, I was on the planning committee for the Naturally Latinos conference. And so this is a little bit of a continuation of that conversation. And so just to kind of give you a little bit more about me personally, besides all of those other things that I shared, I use he, him pronouns. I am part of the queer community and part of the Latinx community. I'm also adopted. So I was born in Guatemala, but I grew up here in Maryland. And I really like nature. I would also say that I typically am an advocate for anybody who's part of the communities that I'm part of. And I really like kind of being there if anybody needs anything. And so a couple of those things are some of those identities that I really lean into. And all of those are ways that I try to find community. But I will say, even though I hold all of these identities, like none of them should be the thing that I identify with solely. I think they all make up parts of me. And so when I think about, part of me being queer and part of me being a person of color and all of those things, I think of a lot about the resilience and the self-acceptance that I've had to kind of go through with all of those identities. Because I'm adopted, I also grew up in a white family. And so I will talk a little bit more about that, but it's really helped me to do the work of the intersection of different races and how that kind of plays out in society. And so it's something that I also will talk a little bit about because it's part of my experience here tonight. And so a little bit more, I grew up in Pasadena, and just to share a little bit more about the statistics of that area, um, it's 82.6% white. And so I learned a lot from that experience. And I do want to recognize that there is privilege that comes from my upbringing. There, I grew up in a family where we were never super tight on money. And I was able to kind of access resources that other people of color may not have had access to. And so I just like to start with that because, it wouldn't be great of me to kind of go into this and not recognize that. Um, I think adoption, again, is a big part of my identity because I've had to kind of learn as I get older about my identity, as as a Latino or Latinx person. And so it's definitely been something that I work through sometimes. And I know that looking at all of the identities and races and things like that, it can engulf people sometimes. And so I'm kind of coming to my own terms with that. And I grew up in a community that as I reflect back on it was a very harmful and dangerous community. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you that at the time. That's come through a lot of reflection on my own stuff. And then being a queer person, being a queer person can be hard sometimes. I know that, I grew up being told certain things in school that I will not repeat here, and being told that it wasn't okay, even through like my own family. And so there are certain things that I think with people that have these different identities sometimes struggle with, but you get to the other side, and I know everybody says it gets better, but it really does. And so I want to also focus on some opportunities that different groups have that kind of are at the intersection of these identities. Um, and so just kind of talking about the environmental movement in general and the outdoors, I think many people know that it's still a very white-led movement. And so I did a little bit of digging through Green 2.0 released numbers from 2020 recently about kind of any of the progress that has been made in our movement. Specifically relating to people of color. And so in 2020, on average, 26% of staff at organizations was people of color, which is still not very high, but it is a little bit higher than it was. 22% of people who were at the senior level of staff were people of color. So you're going down a little bit at the senior level. And then on boards, it's about 23%. So compared to some of the other numbers, those percentages have gone up a little bit in the past 3 years, but they're still not great. And so I think that one of the things that I want to note is that, a lot of our movement is still not led by people of color. And I think that that's something that is starting to change, but there's more work to do. When I talk about some of my LGBTQ identities and being LGBTQ in this movement, there's actually not a lot of statistics about it. I think that there's probably studies being done, maybe, but there isn't a lot of like solid data there about what it's like to be LGBTQ in the environmental movement. So you might see that a lot of what I share is not as statistic driven for that, and that's just my personal experience that I'm sharing. But I do have some statistics that I will share about kind of the challenges and also the opportunities there for that as well. And so like I said, I'm going to start kind of tackling the issues using the lens as somebody who is Latino first, and then kind of LGBTQ second, and then I will combine them together. And so to kind of talk about that, I just wanted to quickly introduce the idea of intersectionality. I think many of us have heard about it before, but it's actually a lot older than the term itself is a lot older than I think a lot of people even recognize. And so it was originally coined in 1989. And so it's been around for a while. And more broadly, it's how social categories intersect and how those intersections impact different people's experiences. through the structures of power and oppression. And so you can see here that, there's lots of different um, people that are part of intersectional identities. And so, tonight we're kind of focusing on two, but there's so many other possibilities here. Um, and the important thing here is, just keeping in mind how people's lived experiences um, can shape what they're able to go through in their life and also the barriers that they may face. And just a quick little example that I chat about when I come to this is the example of Black feminism. And so, the experience of somebody who is a Black woman is both the experience of a Black person and also a woman. And so you have to think about how all of those identities can interact with each other. And a lot of times it's not just additional things there. You're kind of like multiplying the effects of the world when you have more than one intersectional identity. And so I think that that's something I just want to kind of highlight is that certain people maybe only have like one of these type of identities, and then people that have more than that sometimes experience life a lot differently. And so perfect timing to pause for a question. So does anybody have any questions so far on what I've shared or curious about anything that I've chatted about? And I'm happy to kind of take a moment and answer anything here. And there will be a couple other places where I can stop and answer any questions.
While we wait for our audience to type their questions in the chat, I have one.
Okay.
So you're touch a little bit on how the different intersections or how many lenses your life has. So could you give us an example of how you have seen this concept of intersectionality play out in your own experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I definitely will dig into a little bit more too. But I think for me, it's something that there are times where, um, as a queer person, I don't always feel as comfortable in spaces that are majority Latinx or Latinx spaces. And so it's something that I find, oh, for my racial identity, maybe I'm in a space that feels right. It feels correct. It feels like I'm around people that look like me. But then I also don't always find that it's as accepting of me being gay. And so there are definitely ways in which one of my identities could feel okay, and then there are spaces where one of them doesn't. And so another example that I know that I will chat about a little bit later too is sometimes I'm in spaces that are mainly gay, so like white gay men particularly, and then my experience as a person of color isn't as accepted or isn't seen as something that is as important. And so I think for the people that are living at those different identities and living with different historically marginalized aspects of their life, it can be challenging to find spaces that feel like open and accepting. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it did.
Absolutely, that was a great example. Thank you so much. And Lucas is relating to what you're saying.
Yeah,
It's his experience as well.
yeah, yeah. It can be hard sometimes to navigate. So I'm thank you for sharing, Lucas. Well, I maybe you can unmute. I'll ask Saranella.
So usually I entertain the questions myself because of the audience size, but I think we can swing it today.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much, Saranaya. I was just gonna say, like, I thought that was I have experienced that too, but like I don't really like think about it. It's not something that I'm like constantly like, oh, that's why that happened. I'm just like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. But it's like, yeah, you like see these people when you're trying to like date and they're like, oh, I only want to date, like a white person. And it's like, okay, well, I guess even though I'm gay, like I'm not gonna be interacting you like in that sort of way and stuff like that. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely relate to that, and I appreciate you for sharing that. I think it's something that a lot of us live with, and it's something that I think being in the environmental community sometimes can make it a little bit more challenging. You know, how many times am I in a room that uh, is mainly white, or how, like, am I in a room where there aren't other queer people? Um, And Denise, you have a great question about how you can be an ally to people with different multiple intersections. And I think one of the things that I will say, and I don't actually, I go into a little bit of detail, but maybe I can chat a little bit more about it. Is being an ally kind of starts with like learning about somebody's different identities. And so I talk a lot about it with the LGBTQ plus community in general, is that being an ally is continued effort and it's continued learning. I'm learning myself. I think it's something that sometimes I think I'm up to date on things and things change. And so just being open to continuing to learn. And then the other thing is, if you've built a good relationship with somebody with multiple identities, it's just to listen to them and to listen to how they're feeling and what they need from other people. Um, but the thing about being an ally is that it does take continued work. And I think, it's not always I'm going to know everything about all of somebody's identities, but, maybe do a little bit of digging on your own if you aren't as familiar with somebody's identity, and learn how you can support, each person's multiple identities, and then that person as a whole. Because I've shared before, like I do relate to all of these identities, but they also, like, none of them individually make up all of me. So I hope that helps, but I'll chat a little bit more about that as we continue also. Okay, and like I said, we'll have more time for questions. Oh, and thank you, Saranella, for adding that comment, and Amelia for watching. All right, and so like I said, I'm gonna talk about some of the challenges facing each community individually, and you'll see that I'm gonna bring it all together in a little bit. And so some of these are things that we're facing, as communities as a whole, or maybe they're individual people. But then I want to talk about how that brings out different strengths in us, basically, because I don't want it to be like a whole really sad presentation. And so the first thing that I'm going to share about is something that I think it would be not great for me to not talk about when we talk about, the Latinx community. And it focuses a little bit on environmental justice and community health. And so one of the things that a lot of us have been dealing with, but particularly communities of color recently, has been COVID-19. And so we know that many communities of color have had, uh, major differences in the amount of people that could have COVID-19. And so, for the Latinx community, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of that is distrust in healthcare in general. We also know that, many Latinos work in communities where they can't, or work in places where they can't work from home, and they don't have access to healthcare, housing, or food. And so that all can play into kind of how COVID-19 spread and kind of the issues that people are facing. And one of the things that I wanted to share is somebody who was actually on the panel with me about this particular topic recently, and that's Amanda Machado. And she had posted something recently about getting her COVID-19 shot. And so it said that, I can only count a handful of medical experiences I've had in the US that have been genuinely positive. Dozens have been painful, infuriating, borderline traumatic. So taking this vaccine was honestly up there with one of the scariest things I've ever done. And so again, it's one of those things that it does play into kind of our movement in certain ways, and I thought that I should at least chat about it a little bit. And I see from Paul on Facebook, I've often said that it's harder to come out as a birder to my gay friends than when it was to come out as gay to my birder friends. Have you had any similar experience with the gay LGBT community, that they shun you for being into the environment? I think for me, I maybe haven't had the same experience, but I've heard a lot of people that have had the experience where it's hard to come out as someone in the environmental community. I think for me personally, I think I've really intentionally built community that I know is going to support me recently, and so I'm really trying to surround myself with people that that are supportive of what I do for both work and that I'm interested in. But I will say that in the past, I've definitely, um, had the experience where people aren't as accepting about, one or two of my identities. One of the things that I say, and maybe it's just my own personal experience here, is that I often find that I struggle more with my racial identity than I do with my queerness. And so I don't know if that resonates with anyone, but like I knew from a very young age that I was queer and that I was different, and that changed a lot like the older that I got. So anyway, I'm going to keep pushing us forward. So environmental contaminants, as we also know, are big concerns for the Latinx community. And so, 1/3 of Latinos live in states where there's lots of chemical contaminants like arsenic or industrial chemicals or fertilizers that can contaminate their drinking water. That again goes into kind of the environmental justice side of the issues that people face. Air pollution is another one. And then when I think about my experience kind of in cities, we see that a lot of, Latin communities are in areas where there is a lot more pollution. And so in a 2019 report, there was one where it showed that a lot of Latino communities suffer 63% more harmful particulate matter kind of in the air than than they produce. And so it also showed that non-Hispanic white communities actually experience 17% less harmful particulate matter than they produce. So we know that these communities are ones where they're getting more air pollution than they're even producing on their own. I think the other thing that I think about a lot for Latinos specifically is kind of the lack of access to certain resources in Spanish, and also kind of the mainstream environmental movement is still very geared towards, white communities. And so my examples here are photos from different marketing campaigns for different reusable products, just kind of as an example here. But one of the big issues with the Spanish resources are that, there's a lot of communities working on environmental issues that are not translating their materials into Spanish, or if they are, maybe they don't have somebody that can answer questions in Spanish if they get emails or calls about it. And so it's really important to kind of take a moment and like intentionally think about how people in the environmental movement are engaging with this community in particular. And then, of course, there's not a lot of representation in green spaces or access to green spaces. And so I just Googled people hiking as an example for this slide. And, a lot of the pictures that came up were of white people enjoying nature. And access to green spaces is something that I also think is really important. And so I talk about it in Annapolis, where I live, even though I'm not joining you from Annapolis tonight. And this is a map of all of the public places where you can get to water. And as you can see, there's little blue dots where they're at, but there actually aren't many. And it's not accessible to the communities that maybe we are trying to make it accessible to. And some of these you also have to pay to get to. So Quiet Waters, there's a fee to get into the park. And so when you think about accessibility and kind of those challenges or barriers that are there, it can be really hard to find space to like go and enjoy nature sometimes. And so I struggle with that myself. You know, I'm very lucky that my office is like very close to the water, but a lot of the homes there are private properties all along the water. And so this is just like one example of one city, but I'm sure that there are a lot more that are similar to this elsewhere. So where are the opportunities here? You know, there's a lot of studies that are coming out now that are showing that Hispanic, Latino, and other people of color are really motivated by the environment, and they really care about the environment, which I don't think surprises those of us that are part of those communities. You know, one of the statistics is that, you know, Hispanics and Latinos are more likely than whites to attribute global warming to human activities, as well as to support action to protect the environment. Um, there was a poll that was done before the 2020 presidential election that showed registered Hispanic and Latino voters placed global warming as their sixth most important concern for the new president to kind of tackle, versus non-white Hispanic registered voters, where it was their 17th item on their list. And so it's just a couple of those statistics that show that, you know, we do really care about the environment, and we're here and we want action to happen. And so there's already that push coming from the community itself. And so this is another chart here, and this one is from Earth Justice, which I'm sure that, you know, a lot of people have heard about. But, you know, I mean, again, a lot of Latinos believe that, you know, it's really important to reduce air pollution and smog. It's really important to have clean energy sources and to have clean water and to conserve water, and protecting, you know, wildlife, public lands, and endangered species. And so it just kind of leans into that idea that, like, as Latinos, as people that identify as Latino, um, you know, we care about the environment, which is something that I think certain people don't necessarily believe. And so I have another break here. If anybody has any questions on what I just talked about. The voter priorities, yeah. It's one of the things that, again, I'm part of the community, and I was a little bit surprised. Yeah.
So I have a question. Through my interactions with some media outlets, we see that most of the perception of what the priorities are within the Latina community, it's totally disconnected from the statistics that we are seeing and the statistics that you just presented. Can you talk about why, or maybe postulate a theory on why we have that huge disconnect between what we think it's happening and what's really happening?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things there. I think some of those statistics, kind of that I pointed out even, were for, you know, registered voters. There's a lot of people that maybe aren't registered to vote. I think that there's likely large groups of people that might be missing from those statistics. And so I wonder, for the people that are doing those studies, how they have tried to connect specifically with the Latin community, the Latinx community, because, you know, again, like you've shared, I think that sometimes the numbers don't always add up and don't always make sense. But I think that there are barriers there. The other thing is, are they going out and, you know, asking people these questions in Spanish? And are they connecting to, you know, Spanish speakers about about, you know, their feels about the environment? So there's a couple of things there that could be barriers to getting more accurate numbers.
Thank you. That is all for now.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to LGBTQ and environmental intersections. And so a lot of these are actually things that I learned at a summit, which is for LGBTQ people working in the environmental field. So It was supposed to happen actually last February, and then COVID happened. But I would highly recommend, if you are part of the LGBTQ community working in the outdoors, that you check this out when it comes back. Again, there's not a lot of data on this, and I know that a lot of the people involved in planning this summit even said that Green 2.0 maybe should be doing this, and they're not. A couple of the barriers that I'll go, into a little bit more is that there isn't a safe and inclusive job pipeline for a lot of LGBTQ folks, especially for transgender identifying individuals. I think it can be really hard sometimes to find organizations that have done enough work to feel accepted and to feel like you belong. Again, when you think of the outdoors, I think a lot of times we're looking at like national parks and big green spaces, and a lot of LGBTQ folks don't live out in the middle of nowhere. And so a lot of LGBTQ folks also rely on public transit, as do a lot of communities of color, and many live paycheck to paycheck, again, as many communities of color do. And so you'll start seeing that there's a lot of connections here in ways that these communities kind of have overlapping barriers in some ways. So I have a quote here from Isla Hernandez, who you guys probably have seen on Instagram, but it says LGBTQ2S plus people have always existed pre-colonial era, and their work has been attempted to be erased by colonialism. Environmental colonialism perpetuated cis heteronormative as being natural, while punishing and making it a crime to be LGBTQ2S plus. In the United States, black and brown trans women of color have been at the forefront of queer liberation and rights movements, and still face the most discrimination today in society. We cannot solely advocate for climate justice while silencing the needs of queer, trans, two-spirit communities, and it must center their work, ethics, and values. So another couple of statistics here about LGBTQ folks as it relates to the environmental movement, and things to think about as we talk about being more inclusive and environmental justice and all of these things, is that a lot of LGBTQ youth unfortunately experience homelessness. If you look at the general population, they make up about 7% of the population, but they make up about 40% of the homeless youth population. A lot of those are because of family issues. They were forced out, or they ran away, or they had family issues, aged out of foster care. That one kind of hits close to home for me, abuse at home, and sometimes like their family just couldn't provide. And so there's a lot of reasons there, but it's something to think about. In terms of disaster relief, we're seeing that climate patterns are changing, especially kind of as we're moving forward. And so we're seeing that a lot of organizations that really focus on disaster relief really aren't always able to provide for all LGBTQ folks. And so I will dig a little bit more into this in my next slide. And so again, kind of similar to some of the issues when you're talking about people that are Latino, the LGBTQ plus community isn't always getting the information that they need about certain disasters. Emergency shelters can't always serve LGBTQ folks, and there's a couple examples after Hurricane Katrina had hit, where individuals who were transgender were told that they could use their bathroom of their gender, and then the police were called because people were uncomfortable and went to jail basically because people felt that they weren't using the correct bathroom. And so like those are just things to think about when we think about this community and how the intersections can be hard. And this happens all over the world. There's an example from India where there's a group of people, the Avarinas, and who they are neither male or female. And after a tsunami, they actually weren't even counted in the records of the people that had died, basically. And so this shows like kind of a more systematic level in that case where, there were some challenges. Food insecurity, I'm not going to read all of the statistics here, but like a lot of LGBTQ folks don't have constant access to food. And so the important bullet that I'll kind of point out here is the last one, which shows that LGBTQ people of color are more likely to be food insecure than LGBTQ white people. And so you'll see that, you know, the biggest group is going to be African American, but Hispanics and Latinos are pretty close behind that, as well as American Indians. Again, air pollution, there was a study done that really focused on same-sex houses. So it didn't include the entire LGBTQ plus community, but it did show that they were more likely to have a risk of hazardous air pollutions. And then again, we're talking about the representation that's there. You know, generally it's still very cisgender or white or fit or whatever you want to say about that. And there's a lot of groups that I see more and more kind of doing the rainbow washing, where they're supporting with pride flags and rainbows, and then they're not really doing anything to back that up. And so those are things that like I think can be really harmful for people that, you know, we want to spend our money in places that we know are going to support us. And so in terms of opportunities for LGBTQ plus people, you know, I think there's a lot. We're a very resilient community. You know, this is a good quote from Noah Goodwin from GLAAD, who says, "As queer people, our existence together is powerful. We came together from seemingly disparate communities to fight. We created a force united in liberation. We can do the same to fight against climate change. The time is to act is now. There is no planet B." And so I think it's really important to think about when we think about the LGBTQ plus fight for equality, you know, it really did start with a whole bunch of people who maybe wouldn't have known each other otherwise coming together to fight. And this is just a picture from my organization from before COVID, where we got together and did like a Pride Month get together. And so some of the shared challenges, you've heard me kind of talk about some of them: air pollution, food insecurity, access to green spaces, representation, and I could go on about this forever and ever and ever. And I don't have time because I could talk about this forever. But what about those of us that are kind of living at those intersections? Because we've talked about these as kind of separate things. And so, you know, we tend to be in spaces where some of our identities might not be accepted. And one of the things that I've shared about is that I have to kind of intentionally build spaces of acceptance. And I'm happy to chat with anybody, you know, offline about how I've started to do that, because it's been really important for me to find people that look like me, that support me when we're going outdoors and when I have issues that I need to talk about. You know, I think the representation is lacking. I think there needs to be a space where more people can share their stories and can open up about what they're going through and find people to support them. I think that there's a lot of progress happening though. You know, we think about groups like Intersectional Environmentalist, which if you're on Instagram, you should definitely follow them, where they're kind of giving a spotlight to people who have a couple of different identities and talking about how their work is important and how they can kind of keep creating things and moving the bar forward when we're talking about equality, because we're not really all, you know, we're not there yet. We have a lot of work to do. And so I do want to give a little bit of time at the end for more questions. I feel like I went through that a lot slower than I had expected to. So I kind of was pushing there at the end a little bit, but I'm happy to share more about my experience or any of the questions that maybe have come up since I've been sharing.
Thank you so much, Joe. One question that came to my head as you were talking is that fact that not everybody feels safe and included in the outdoor spaces that we think we all enjoy. And there might be a couple of people that do have the power to change things in the park that listen to this particular recording. Let's all hope. So if you had a microphone that went directly to those who can make those spaces more inclusive, what would you tell them?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think one of them, in terms of being more inclusive for, you know, somebody who might be part of the LGBTQ plus community, is there are like small things. I think one of them is asking, as Denise actually had put in the chat, is don't make assumption about somebody's pronouns. You don't know how somebody identifies unless you really get to chat with them. The other thing I do like to share about pronouns, at least, is not um, don't force people to share their pronouns either. There are some people that maybe are questioning, that aren't sure, that might not feel comfortable sharing. So it's something that maybe you share yours, and you can encourage anybody that's comfortable to share their own. I think gender inclusive restrooms, if it's possible, is another really important place. I know that I have some friends who are transgender who don't always feel comfortable using public restrooms. And so that's one thing that I think about. I think in terms of, you know, the Latinx experience, it can be things like um, having materials available in Spanish for those people that don't speak English. I think sometimes it also depends on kind of the people that are already there in the spaces. And so, like, you know, Hispanic people and queer people and Latinx people, like, we're all going to recreate differently. And so hopefully the people that are there are not going to judge that or um, cause a ruckus, I guess is the best way to put it. But we've seen that happen in the past. And so some of it is about who's already there. And so I think sometimes it takes that one person who maybe works there or maybe is visiting a place that is comfortable being who they are. And that can be challenging. That can be a challenge to find.
Thank you. I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on the bathroom situation, because I don't know about the rest of our audience, but not having the experience to have to worry about how much water I drink or how much I eat because I need to control my body fluids. It was mind blowing to me that some of our communities are having to go through those extraneous circumstances to be able to be in the spaces that should be for all. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, it's something that, you know, I don't identify as transgender, so it's not my personal experience. So I just want to put that out there. But I do think that it can be a lot harder. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced it, but I did experience it a little bit during COVID because a lot of places weren't open. So it was really hard to be able to go somewhere outdoors and not have a restroom available. But those are the things that they're things that I don't think a lot of people think about that can impact somebody else's experience. And so I do know, like, I've had a couple of friends share that, like, it can be really hard sometimes to go into these spaces that maybe are not as accepting. Um, and being judged based on how they're expressing themselves. I think that sometimes there's this idea for transgender individuals that if they quote pass, which means that like they look like the gender that they identify as, like it's easier, but that shouldn't be like a goal. It creates this very like um, I want to say like it feeds into the binary a little bit of like you're either male or female. And so like there are people that identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming. And then for those people, there's also not when like the options are male and female, there's not an option that really fits how they are. And so it's really important to think about um, the usage of those facilities and like how just a sign can make a big impact on somebody else.
Thank you. From Facebook, we have Amelia who would like to ask, do you have any resources or book recommendations for educators in the field that are looking to be more inclusive?
I assume we're talking about kind of both of these identities. And I actually don't have any great recommendations for that. I've done a lot of digging just through online articles and through the people that I know personally. I'm definitely happy to chat more about kind of where I found that kind of after this presentation. Oh, and my email is on this slide, so feel free to email me. I do have a couple of things that I can link you to and send out if you're interested. But there aren't a lot of uh, things that have been put out that really focus on the intersectionality in terms of books. I will say, Leah Thomas, who kind of started intersectional environmentalism, is in the process of releasing a book about intersectional environmentalism that will come out next spring. So I've already pre-ordered it because I saw it and I knew that there weren't many things out there that focus on this in particular. And a really great place to start digging for more information is the Intersectional Environmentalist website. And you can just search Intersectional Environmentalist and it will give you some resources for different intersectional identities. I think there's like a resource hub on there. And so I've listened to some podcasts that I've heard through that, followed certain people on social media that that have helped educate me because I'm always learning too. I don't ever want to claim to be an expert on all of these topics, you know, because they change and I'm learning. So yeah.
Wonderful, Joe. Thank you so much. I know we are a little bit past 8 o'clock, but it's our tradition at the tail end of our live stream and our talks to open the microphone from the audience and invite them to ask any last questions or comments directly to the speaker. So if you have a burning question or something that you would like to contribute tonight, please unmute yourself. And I am going to start things up with Denise. Would you like to please share your video, unmute yourself, and tell us a little bit of how can people join this wonderful team?
Hi. Actually, on the road, so I'll have to just be on audio at the moment. But I want to just say thank you, Joe. Wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. Really appreciate every time you have anything to share with us. Absolutely. And I have a shameless plug for our ANS conservation department. We are hiring for our DC conservation advocate position. So I'll drop the link in the chat box so you guys can check out the link. Applications close soon, next week actually. So please share around if you know someone that's looking for a job and hope you apply. Thank you.
All right, and we have a comment from Amelia on Facebook. Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful presentation, and she definitely want to follow those Instagram accounts. Always there is more to learn.
Great. I'm glad you got a lot out of it. And like I said, it's really, really great to start for me just to start looking in different places. And so it's amazing that like Instagram and Twitter sometimes are the places where I find links to articles that I just get so drawn into that teach me a lot. And Lucas actually does have a recommendation in the chat about queer theory and an article there linked. So that's
Want to unmute yourself, Lucas?
Oh, hi. Thank you guys so much for just like bringing the representation for this presentation and everything. I really had a great time. Yeah, the article that I just posted in there was just because some people seem like they wanted to become better allies for the LGBTQ plus community, and I've just been doing a lot into reading about like how time is perceived differently for queer communities, communities that are like other than the norm and everything. So I thought this article was really helpful for me in understanding like people's perspectives who don't understand what it's like to be part of a minority and everything like that. So thought that might help.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank from the bottom of my heart, Joe, thank you for being here and for sharing your voice and your experience. It's always great to see different sections of our Latina community represented on the spotlight. I know it's a very brave place to be, so thank you for being brave and sharing your stories. To our audience, I could not be more grateful to you for your support and your time. I hope that we can continue in this collaboration and learning experience, especially through this week for Latino Conservation Week. Tomorrow, don't forget to join us to hear Felipe Benitez, Executive Director of Corazon Latino, and learn about the American Jobs Plan and how it will affect our community. And on Thursday, we close our online portion of Latino Conservation Week with our very own Denise Guitarra and fighting the good fight with our Latin communities. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Joe. See you all tomorrow.